All right, welcome back to Way of the Wrench, and on today's episode I've got a really cool announcement that I want to share with you guys. We're also going to be starting a new welding series, and to kick off that welding series we're going to talk about what are the pros and cons of the different welders out there, which ones are easier to start on, which one should you think about buying first, maybe which one should you be using for your projects or your individual materials that you're using. So stay tuned, you're not going to want to miss it. So this is the official start to season 2 for Way of the Wrench on YouTube, and this channel and these videos are dedicated for you guys at home, get you excited about tech, get you working with your hands, making cool projects, fixing and repairing cars and learning all the cool theory behind them, doing metalwork projects and welding and anything that gets your hands dirty and making cool stuff. That's what this channel is all about. So the channel's gained a lot of interest lately from people all over the world, and one of the parties to be interested recently is the Canadian Welding Association. How cool is that? So otherwise known as a CWB group. Now this organization is all about getting people excited about working with their hands, getting passionate, making cool projects, and getting them interested in going into the welding trades, as well as giving them the skills and knowledge to become successful and competent red seal welders. So to go along with that, Way of the Wrench is happy to announce that we are starting a partnership with the Canadian Welding Association, and I'm going to be starting a brand new series of welding videos on the channel called How to Become a Welder. These videos are going to be everything and anything about welding, including safety, how to set them up, how to use them properly, how to diagnose, what are the different welders, and as well as having some cool welding projects so you guys can hone your skills at home. And to kick off our new series on how to become a welder, today's video is going to be about the welders themselves. So we're going to give a quick rundown of what they do and how they work. We're going to talk about which ones you should buy first, which ones you should maybe learn first, and which ones are good for your material or your specific project needs. Now, we'll go into greater depth in each of the machines at a later date, so today is just going to be a quick overview. All right, one of the questions that I get asked all the time is there a machine that I should start learning how to weld on first? And the answer is really quite simple. The welder you should start learning on first is the one that you have access to. Doesn't matter if it's gas, MIG, stick, or TIG. All of them have same kind of processes that you will have to learn about. You're going to have to be able to learn about watching your puddle and being able to see where you're going, and at the same time looking behind you to see the bead, to see if you need to make any changes on the fly. You need to be able to diagnose if you're too hot or too cold, or if you've got something wrong with your setup. You need to learn how to tack. There's a lot of stuff going on there that you can learn, and it is all directly relevant to all of the other welding processes. So get access to one welder, learn how to weld on that one, and then all those skills will go to the next one that you decide to learn on. Now, if you're still in high school, I highly recommend that you take an automotive course, take a metalworking course, and get access to as many different types of welders as you can. It's absolutely free for you, $0, and you get to try out all these cool welding processes, and you get to see why so many people ahead of you have loved taking these technology courses and working with their hands and making cool projects and becoming passionate about this industry. Okay, so let's say you don't have a welder at home, but you have to buy something. So what do? Well, first up, I highly recommend you don't go and spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a certain type of welder only to decide that, it's not for you, or you don't like it, or you actually bought the wrong welder and you want something else. What I do recommend is when you're learning, go to Craigslist, go to Facebook Marketplace, and try to find a used machine. Now, you're going to find probably a used stick welder or a used MIG welder of the smaller variety, probably somewhere around 50 to 150, 200 bucks. And that's probably gonna be your best bet. That way you can give it a try, and you can do quite a bit of stuff with that $100 machine, and you're not breaking bank. Now, if I had to simply just rate the welders from cheapest to most expensive, I'd probably be somewhere along the lines of this. Used stick welder, slightly small used MIG welder, then you've got a used or even brand new actually gas welding setup, and then you've got your TIG. Your TIG is going to be the most expensive machine out of all of them. So first welding process up is gas welding, otherwise known as oxyacetylene welding, because of the gases that we are using in these cylinders. So we've got oxygen and we've got acetylene. Now, acetylene can also be any other flammable product such as propane, but in this case we are using acetylene. Now, when you take these two gases and you mix them together and set them on fire, you can make a crazy hot flame that's hot enough to melt our base steel and the filler rod that we are applying while we are doing our welding. Now when we're doing welding, there's something called consumables. So this is the stuff that's being used up while we're doing our welding process. Now when we're doing gas welding, we have to make sure that we have gases in these tanks. They run out, then we can't do more gas welding. And then of course we've got some consumable filler rods. Now usually the filler rod is the same material that you're welding to. So in this case, this is a steel rod, but it's got some copper coating on it to prevent it from rusting. Or you might be using a brazing rod. So this rod has brass covered in a flux coating. Now one of the biggest pros for gas welding is the fact that it is so versatile. We can do a lot of stuff with it. So not only can we weld, we can also braze and put other non-ferrous metals together. We can also do things like if we're working on an old custom car that we can't get these old rusty parts off, well, you can ask very nicely with a torch, heat up the nuts and bolts and get the metal to expand enough that now that comes off like butter. Or when you're done asking and it's got to come off, well, you just take a cutting torch and you cut the part off really quite quickly. So if you're working on something like replacing a full exhaust system on an old car, instead of working and worrying about all these nuts and bolts that are getting replaced, you can just hack them off very quickly with a torch and move on. These cylinders come in all different sizes. So if you're in a big shop and you don't want to go through the gas all that often, you can get really quite large cylinders, or you can get them right down to a little portable unit, which even isn't all that much to buy straight out, maybe about $400 or $500 to have everything in a kit. Now, one of the other big pros for gas welding is the fact that it's the only welding process that doesn't require electricity. So if you were in the middle of nowhere and you need to weld something or braze something or cut something or heat something up, then you can grab one of these little portable tanks and head out in the middle of the forest and get the job done. So the gas welding setup isn't crazy expensive. You know, you've got some hoses and torches and nozzles and a striker and stuff like that. That's a couple $100. But where it gets really quite expensive is if you are buying or purchasing these tanks. They can be several $100s each. However, you can rent them for 10 to 15 bucks a month. So there is that route and option if you need it. Now in our shop, we have all the welders, but I still really like teaching people how to use gas welders first. And the reason why is because your whole life you have been told, don't play with fire, but I'm gonna show you how to play with fire and it's gonna be really quite cool and safe. Now another reason I like teaching gas welding first is all of the skills that you're going to learn when you're doing gas welding are directly related right to the skills you need to be able to be a good TIG welder. The only thing you're really adding is the addition of a foot pedal which controls the heat. So lots of pros for gas welding, but some of the cons for me anyway are that when we get to thin sheet metal or thicker stuff like 1/2-inch plate, the gas welding is not quite the best welder for it. So when you have thin sheet metal, I find it's very tricky to not get too much heat into the sheet metal as you're welding it and have it just warp up and distort and buckle. And then when you get to the thicker stuff like 1/2-inch plate, it can do it. You're gonna have to have a massive nozzle using a ton of gas, and it's still a really quite slow process, especially when you're comparing it to something like MIG welding. So the first welding process that I ever started off with was actually gas welding, and I have a personal love for gas welding. There is nothing cooler than having a cold October, November morning and you snuggle up next to this little heat source and you just get in the zone. You got a nice puddle going and you can see where you're going and you get into a rhythmic pattern of putting in your filler rod and you're watching behind you, looking at all those beautiful stacked dimes, and you just start falling in love with this. It's very calming, it's very chill. You know, you get some city and color playing in the background and it's just a really nice, calm, soothing experience. And then when you're all done, you lift up your green tinted face shield, you look at it and wow, what a beautiful weld, and you want to go show somebody. So first up for our electric welders is a MIG welder. MIG stands for metal inert gas, and in this case we're talking about what's inside that cylinder at the back of the machine here. That is full of a shielding gas that prevents oxygen from the air around us from getting into our metal when it's liquid and bubbling it and frothing it up full of air bubbles, which weakens the weld and makes it not look good. Now when we get into the electric welders, the heat source that's getting hot enough to melt our metals together is being provided by electricity. So in a MIG welder, you are actually changing the voltage, which will increase the temperature of the welding. Right, as for consumables for MIG welders, you do have a spool of wire that will eventually run out. However, these things tend to last a long time, and in fact, this is really one of the top pros for MIG welding. As long as you're pushing the button in here and welding, that spool of wire will just keep coming out, feeding out, and you can weld and weld and weld all day long. You're also going to have to make sure that you've got your shielding gas. When that runs out, it's going to be pretty obvious, not good. However, there is an alternative. If you don't want the bottle and the rentals and the gas and deal with that, you can also install a spool of something called flux core. Now, flux core is wire that has flux built right into the wire, and as it melts, it burns and generates its own shielding gas, so you don't actually have to have this. And so one of the pros of MIG welding is that a lot of people find that this is one of the easiest welders to make a nice, pretty weld. And they're not lying. Literally, with the push of a button, you're welding. The filler rod is being controlled for you as long as everything is set up properly. However, this is also one of the cons for this machine. Because it is so easy to make a very nice, beautiful weld, sometimes there's penetration problems where it does not actually get into the base filler material, and it actually just pops off because the lack of experience is there, or you don't have the machine set hot enough, etc. Now, once you've got this machine set up, this is an industry workhorse. These are the most popular used out in industry because they just get the work done really quickly. You can do long sections and not having to continuously get filler rods, and it's just a beautiful thing to get going. Now, these MIG welders are really quite versatile. They're really, really good at really thin sheet metal because you can get in there, get enough heat to get the puddle melted, get the two pieces together, and then out. So you're not putting a lot of heat, and there's a lot less distortion and warpage in your thin sheet metal projects. And then the flick of a couple knobs, you're going to be welding up to 1/2 inch plate like nobody's business, just lying in there, good penetration, and getting the job done really quite quickly. Now, most of the time you're going to be doing steel wire, but you can also do aluminum wire. You just have to add something called a spool gun, which pulls the wire right at the end of the torch to do the welding, rather than pushing it from the machine and having that thin, flimsy aluminum wire kind of just bunch up inside of your liner. So as the saying goes, you get what you pay for. So you can see the visible size difference between these two machines. So this one here is about $3,000 brand new, welds everything from sheet metal all the way up to about 1/2 inch plate, and it's dependable, reliable. You can weld all day with this thing. This guy here, not so much. I would really doubt if this thing could even weld up to 3/8 plate reliably or without having to do multiple passes. And so this is about the size of the machine that you'd be looking for to try to find something used on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Probably $50 to $150 for use one of these. And start on it, learn it, and then when you upgrade, you got your second welder that you can turn into a flux core dedicated machine, or even get a spool gun and make this your aluminum machine. One of the cons that I would say for MIG welding is that there is a lot of stuff going on here, and you need to know about it to be able to work this thing properly. So we've got gas that we have to be concerned about. Do we have any in the bottle? The regulator, is it set right? Is there wire on the spool? Is that wire getting through the liner okay? Is it sticking on our contact tips that eventually need to be replaced? This gas nozzle needs to be cleaned every now and then. The diffuser can get plugged. The drive wheel settings in here could be too loose and the wire's not feeding, or it's set too high and we're causing bird's nests where the wire bunches up inside. Plus, there's usually a whole bunch of settings on the front of these machines that can be a little more complicated and overkill with what you actually need to be welding. So you can see there's a lot of stuff going on, and I would list that as a con for someone starting into the welding. Now, the third welder that I started learning would have been the MIG welder, and I learned and had most of my time and experience in a production environment. And what I was welding was the hand railings on the Oak Street Bridge. And there's approximately 6 miles of pipe on that bridge that had to be welded, and all the mounting brackets, etc. And that MIG welder was just going 24/7 in that shop, pumping out hand railings for Oak Street Bridge. All right, moving along to our next electric welder, and this one is called a stick welder, otherwise known as a SMWA, which is shielded metal arc welding. And the way this bad boy works is you have electricity and you are melting an electrode into the base metal and making your puddle. Now, these electrodes are made out of your base metal, so the steel, and they have a flux coating on it. And what's happening is that as you start welding, that flux melts and it creates its own shielding gas, so we don't have to have a bottle separate from this process. And that shielding gas is what's keeping the oxygen from outside of the air from getting into our liquid metal and getting it weak and full of holes and porosity. So at first glance, this thing looks ancient. It's like 40, 50 years old for sure. But looks can be deceiving, especially when we're talking about stick welders. They made these things to last back in the day, and genuinely, these are the ones you're gonna find all the time at yard sales and on Craigslist for $50, $100. And don't be afraid to pick them up. Chances are these things work and there's nothing wrong with this. To give you an idea, I found this for free, and all I had to do is put a new plug on it and it works, and we've been using it. It works great. So here's a second stick welder that we have in the shop and we use every day, and this thing is ancient too. It's another 40, 50-year-old machine, but it works reliably, and I have no problems with it at all. The pro for these stick welders is how easy they are to use. There's not a lot of bells and whistles and things to break on them. Really quite simple. plug it into the wall, turn it on. You got a knob for turning down or turning up your amperage, so how hot or how cold your electric spark is going to be. And then you got a couple connections. One of them is going to be for your ground clamp, and then the other one is for your electrode holder, and the other hole is just to switch the polarity for different types of electrodes and different processes that you may or may not be doing. So definitely another positive for having a stick welder is the fact that you can weld material that doesn't have to be perfectly clean. Now, it's always a good practice to make sure that the metal surfaces are super clean, especially TIG welding, but for stick welding, it's not so picky. Think of it this way. Your tractor is broken down in the middle of a field sitting in the mud and you got to get the job done. Well, hook this bad boy up to a generator, just give the surface a wipe with your sleeve and start welding, and you're going to get the job done. Now, one of the pros of stick welding, and yet cons at the same time, is the fact that these stick welders use electrodes. So the pro for these electrodes is that I don't have to spend a ton of money and buy a 50-pound spool of wire that only lets me weld one type of material and maybe in one situation for one type of project. I can literally buy as many or as little of these as I need, and I can change them up whenever I want. So if I can do welding with one project, put these electrodes in, and then my next job requires me to be welding overhead, so that requires a different type of electrode, and I can buy those individually. And so then the cons with these electrodes are the fact that when I go to weld, I have to put an electrode into my electrode holder, and then I start welding, but this is my filler rod as well, so it's going to be consumed. And as I weld, this is going to shrink up on me, so there's a bit of a learning curve where I have to actually be moving this down, otherwise it would just shrink away from the material. And then 30, 40 seconds into my welding, I'm getting into my groove, and my bead looks amazing, but my electrode is now this short, and I have no choice but to stop, kick the old little stubby one out, grab a brand new electrode, put it in, tighten it up, and then I want to keep welding. So I've already had to interrupt there, which is not very good. But the other thing is, before I start welding again, I have to actually take a chipping hammer, hammer off the slag that's built, that burnt up flux that's on top of the weld, and then I got to take a wire brush and clean it before I can start welding again. So you can see it's a very time-consuming process when compared to something like MIG welding. Now, although I just listed the fact that you have to use a chipping hammer and a wire brush to clean up the welds after you do stick welding, I personally, on an artistic level, kind of find that as a pro. It's kind of like the equivalent of opening up presents on Christmas. You spend all this time and effort and energy to lay a perfect bead, and then when you're done and you lift up your helmet and you look at it, and it looks like garbage, to be honest. It looks just like a big lumpy piece of black. And then you take your chipping hammer and you give it a little tap, and that flux, that slag comes off in one big chunk, and this beautiful miracle bead sits on there underneath, and instantly you're proud and want to show people how cool that looks. So for me, that kind of is listed under the pro. Some other cons that I find for stick welding are kind of minor ones, but they're valid cons for me. I find that there's a little bit more spatter, even though when you know what you're doing and you got the electrode the right distance from the metal, there tends to still be a little bit of spatter, which looks like little balls that are out from the welds that are kind of temporarily stuck to the top of the metal. And in most cases, you just kind of tap it with a hammer and it takes off, unless they're really bad and you actually got to grind them off. So that could be listed as a con. You know, it's not quite as beautiful as it could be, you know, if you were comparing it to TIG welding. Other cons I would list as it's not the greatest welder for sheet metal. You could turn it down, but it's too hot, it's too penetrating, it's just going to melt that sheet metal up and warp it up on you. So I wouldn't use this for sheet metal. But anything big, half-inch plate, and you want to build a building or a structure or a tank, go for it. These things are rock stars for that. So another minor con for me are they're kind of a pain in the butt to do tack welds, because you've already got this process where you have to start it to get it to not stick when you start welding, which we'll talk about in a future video. So when you're trying to just do one little tack, you kind of have to strike and do the tack at the same time. And it's a little bit difficult, not impossible, but it's just something that's not as easy as the other three welders. One of my first electric welders that I was learning on would have been a stick welder, really easily accessible in my high school. And I kind of had a love-hate relationship with it in the beginning. So when you're a newbie and learning how to stick weld, it tends to have the electrodes stick every single time until you get used to what you have to do. Now there's some tricks which I'll talk about in future videos, but I did not like and enjoy that part. You'd have electrodes stick and all the flux would come off and you'd be shaking it and the parts go flying. And so it's not a fun experience in the beginning, but once you get past that, it has the benefit of making a super cool, beautiful weld and hiding it under some ugly slag that you get to chip off and get to see that after. Finally, on to the last electric welding process, which is TIG. Now, we also have something else to talk about here because my one and only TIG machine is actually a multi-function machine, meaning that can be switched over to stick welding as well. And you can actually go buy multifunction machines that can do stick / TIG / MIG / flux core, which is really quite cool. You can save space in your shop for other cool things. And the only thing I would say about getting a multifunction machine is that if you are cheaping out and buying a very cheap one, you will be able to do all those welding processes, but not as good as one dedicated machine that is higher end and capable at doing its full potential. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to buy something cheap that's multifunction. Out of all four of these welding processes, I would say that TIG welding is the upper echelon of welding status. If you are a good TIG welder, that's something you can brag about with your welding buddies. Now, the reason for that is TIG welding is very finicky, very precise, ultra clean work. You're welding something up for the space industry. There's zero blemishes and there's zero cleanup. Literally, the welds come out looking cleaner than when you put the weld down. So TIG welding, TIG stands for tungsten inert gas. Now, the tungsten refers to what the electrode is made of that's sitting in our torch here. And it's like the electrode on our stick welder, except instead of it being consumed and used up as we weld, it's only providing a place for the electricity to jump out and create the heat needed to melt our base metal. Now, the inert gas refers to the bottle back here. So once again, we're using a shielding gas to prevent oxygen from getting into our welds and making them weak and full of holes. And the other thing that we've got to do is we've got to melt the filler rod here. So we're back to doing a process much like gas welding, where we are manually applying a filler rod to make our welds strong. And so I find often that if you are a good gas welder, all those skills go hand in hand with TIG welding, and they will make you a better TIG welder. So maybe not a bad idea to start with gas welding until you get to TIG welding. Now, one of the really cool things about TIG welding is the fact that you can control how much amperage is going to the actual electrode. Now, you preset the maximum amount of amperage on the machine, and that means that when you have the foot pedal all the way down, that's the maximum amperage you're going to get. When you're off the pedal completely, you're getting 0 amps, and you can have anything in between depending how much you're pushing down on the pedal. One of the ways I like to teach about this is think of this as like a gas pedal for your car. So off the pedal, you're not moving. Pushing all the way down to the ground, that's full throttle or full amperage going to your electrode. So a lot of control and a lot of precision able to be had with this pedal. One of the biggest pros for TIG welding is the fact that you have ultimate control over the entire welding process. So you've got a foot pedal to control how hot or how cold your arc is getting. You've got manual manipulation of your filler rod, so a little bit more or a little bit less, or even no filler rod. So like gas welding, you can actually weld without the filler rod. It's not going to be as strong, but you have that option. And you can adjust this on the fly. So if you're welding something that's thicker and it starts to go thinner on you, you got to back off on the heat, so you can do that with the pedal. And then the other thing you can do too is when you're welding and something's getting too hot, starting to melt through, and you don't want to do that, you can back off the heat as well. So really finite control is available with TIG welding. So now you've got a con for that as well. So all of those things that we just listed are actually kind of makes this thing a harder machine to learn, right? You've got a foot pedal to control, you've got your torch in one hand, you've got your filler rod in the other, you've got gas, you've got your settings here, and you're changing it on the fly depending on your project. So that's definitely a con too. It's a little bit harder to learn. However, if you are a good gas welder, you've got all of that stuff nailed down already. The only thing you're adding to it is the foot pedal, and at that point it's actually pretty cool because you can control the heat source, which you couldn't do with gas welding. So another pro for TIG welding would be the fact that it makes the prettiest looking welds. So if you're trying to weld something where it's aesthetically got to be looked at all the time and you want it to look amazing, you know, you're looking at this someone's custom welded chassis on their race car or something going into space on a rocket ship, it's probably going to be TIG welded so that the welds are very precise, very clean, perfect looking. And when you're looking at Instagram at all these people bragging about their welding, that's usually what process they've been using. They've been showing off a TIG weld. Now, kind of a tiny con for TIG welding is the fact that the materials that you were welding on need to be absolutely spotless. If there's any kind of dirt and debris or slag or paint or rust, it's really going to affect the quality of your welds, and it's going to be really quite visible. So kind of a con, got to have it clean. Should really be cleaning your welds with whatever you're doing, but for TIG welding, it's super, super picky. So another con for TIG welding would definitely be that there's a bunch of complicated stuff going on here that you have to learn. And even inside this torch head, you've got a bunch of stuff that you need to know about. So for example, you got these little electrodes, these tungsten electrodes. You need other ones to do aluminum. You need specific little angles ground onto the end, and it's really quite common that when you're learning how to TIG weld, you dip this into the puddle and it gets contaminated and you got to regrind it and start all over. And then on the end here, we've got a gas cup, and it's made out of ceramic material. So when you drop it, it breaks, and then you got to have these on hand. And then inside here, we've got collets, and there's O-rings that can start leaking the gas. And so there's a bunch of stuff even just in here. Then you got your inert gas, and then there's all the settings on the front of the machine that can kind of overwhelm someone who's new to TIG welding. So what kind of projects, what kind of metal would I be using a TIG welder for? I like to think of it as very precise work. So if I've got something super, super thin, super delicate, I have to watch how much heat I put in, I would use a TIG welder. If it needs to be aesthetic, right? I'm making something like a custom aluminum race chassis, or I'm making something for aerospace and it's got to be perfect. It's got to look perfect and have full penetration. Then that would be a TIG welder. So when would I not want to use a TIG welder? Well, first up, if it's my first machine I'm buying, it's going to be really expensive. There's not a lot of used ones out there, and even if you find them, they're still pretty expensive. So first off, that's one of the big reasons. The other one is it's not a speed welding machine. It's a delicate, make perfect welding machine that's absolutely clean. So if you are welding long sections of stuff and it's all structural, you're probably gonna be on a MIG welder instead of a TIG welder. So the very last welder that I learned was the TIG welder, and I ended up working at Toyota for about 10 years, and I was doing a lot of erosion repairs on their steel molds that made the aluminum wheels for cars and trucks for Toyota vehicles. And I felt that I was able to pick that up really quite quickly and master it because of all of the experience and time that I spent learning about gas welding. It's almost the same process, just a slightly different heat source, and you just have to figure out this pedal and how you can control the heat. But once you figure out that control of the heat, now it becomes quite cool. You are a master welder and you can adjust heat on the fly and adjust filler rod, and it's a really quite cool thing to learn. Man, I just about forgot about spot welders. Probably because it's not one of the traditional types of welders that people think about when they want to learn. Also maybe because it's a bit simple. So how this one works is we've got a handle here. When you lift up, the tongs separate. Then you put your sheet metal in between those tongs, position them exactly how you want them. And then when you push down, the contact tips push the metal together, sends a bunch of electricity between the two and melts them into a tiny little spot. Hence the term spot welder. Now the pros for this is it's really good for sheet metal because it only puts enough heat just for that one little spot and nothing extra. And it's really simple to use. Cons for this thing, it really is only for sheet metal because as the pieces get too thick, there's not enough power to get the two to actually melt together. Even though it might seem like it's together and you pull it apart really easy. The other con with this is it can only do flat sheet metal surfaces together. If you want to do something like a T-joint, it's just not possible on a spot welder. All right, that's a wrap on our very first episode of How to Become a Welder. Hopefully you enjoyed it and got something out of it, and now have a really good idea of what type of welder you might want to save up for, or what type of welder that you want to start learning first based off of your material or your projects that you're welding and the pros and cons that we just talked about. If you haven't already, please, I'd love a like and a subscribe, and if you smash that post notification button, you will know when the very next How to Become a Welding episode comes out. If you would like any behind the scenes information, please follow us on Instagram, Way of the Wrench. And once again, a very special thank you to the Canadian Welding Association for our awesome partnership. And I look forward to working with you guys and making more cool videos for everyone to learn about welding. So, until next time, take it easy.